We continue talking about Plato's Apology of Socrates. So Socrates is wise because he understands that he doesn't understand everything. He recognizes he has room to grow. He's humble enough to admit that there's always more to learn, and that allows him to continue asking questions. If you think you already know everything, then you don't realize there's room to grow, which means you shut down your own intellectual inquiry and you kind of get stuck in whatever status quo that you are in. So Socrates is benefited by his wisdom because it allows him to continue learning. That's how he's personally benefited. How does he benefit the community? Well, he compares himself to a horsefly. He says, I am a gadfly given to the state by God. And the state is like a great and noble horse who is lazy because of its great size and is required to be stirred into life by some stinging fly. I, Socrates, am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. So he's like a horsefly that bites a horse. In what way is the horse benefited? Well, if it's a big, strong horse that tends to be lazy, if it just lies down all day, its muscles start to atrophy. So when that fly bites it, it's forced to move, and thereby it maintains its strength and vitality. He thinks Athens is the same way. It's a very great civilization, and it's inherited a lot of strengths, but it tends to intellectually lie down. So instead of questioning the truths of the past to determine whether or not they are still true and valid for now, we just accept them as true. And so when Socrates goes around town and points out that our belief systems may be flawed, he thinks he's stinging us in the same way that a fly stings a horse. It forces us to exercise our intellectual muscles. So he thinks, and by rethinking, the very thing he's questioned us about. So interestingly, Socrates doesn't perceive himself as harming the state through his philosophizing. He sees himself as helping the state continue to grow culturally and intellectually. So the way that he does this is through logical refutation. Now this word means something specific. It doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong, I refuted you. It means that even if I don't have an argument of my own about something, I can still refute you by showing that elements of your argument contradict themselves. So take Meletus here. He starts in premise 1 by saying Socrates is an atheist, doesn't believe in God whatsoever. Okay, Socrates responds saying that, well, isn't it true that if I believe in supernatural activity, then necessarily I must believe in a supernatural being? So you might say, wait, how does that follow? Think about it. If you believe that a horse race has been run, don't you also believe in horses? If you believe that a football game has been played, don't you also believe in the players? So if you believe in supernatural experience, well, don't you also believe in a supernatural being who it was that performed that experience? So Meletus says, okay. But then look at step 3. Meletus also agrees that Socrates does believe in supernatural activities. Now join 2 and 3 together. Okay, if you believe in the activity, you believe in the subject. Socrates believes in supernatural activities. Meletus himself says that. Therefore, he must now admit that Socrates does believe in supernatural beings. But wait a minute, that's the opposite of number 1. So Meletus says one thing, and then he says the opposite of what he just said. That means Meletus's own argument doesn't make any sense. Now, that doesn't mean he's wrong. I know that sounds strange. It just means that the way that he argued his point was flawed because Socrates was able to show that two of his points contradicted each other. So Meletus needs to rethink his view, kind of fix the cracks, and then come back. All right, this isn't the best example of refutation, but it's the only one we really see in Apology. In the Republic, we will see several that will be a little bit more solid. At this point in the story, the jury suggests that they might acquit him, find him not guilty if he agrees to stop practicing philosophy. It's a kind of a plea bargain. And he rejects the offer, and he says, the life which is unexamined, it's not worth living. Not worth living. He's attached so much value to examining the meaning of his own identity, of the Athenian religion, of war, of money. He can't imagine a life has meaning unless one can at least understand the meaning that one's life has. So them asking him to stop practicing philosophy is asking him to stop valuing what he finds valuable in life. And furthermore, right, he thinks that God wants him to be a philosopher, right? And that's why the Oracle of Delphi told him what she did. So were he to quit practicing philosophy, not only would he be betraying his own value system, he would be betraying what he believes God's intentions are for him. So he says, no, I can't do it. Even if it means I die, I can't stop practicing philosophy. So ultimately they do find him guilty, and it was a closer vote than he predicted, but they do find him guilty. At this point, they're going to sentence him. They give him an opportunity to speak. He gets a little bit sarcastic and says, what I really deserve from you is that you pay my rent and my food for the rest of my life. So he says, I've been helping you all these years, and now you're punishing me. What I really deserve from you is your gratitude. At which point, they sentence him to death. Now, why does he think he has been condemned? Well, he claims that it's because he didn't beg for his life. He didn't bring his children and his wife in front of them crying in order to appeal to their sympathy. He spoke his truth about how he became a philosopher, how he was benefited by it, and how he believed he benefited the state. So he just matter-of-factly laid it out, and he didn't do what they expected him to do, which was to appeal to their emotions and sympathy. For that reason, he says, they condemned me because I didn't flatter them in the way that they wanted to be flattered. So he's about to be executed, and is he afraid of death? Now, the fear of death is a very powerful experience. And he, according to Athenian custom, he would be executed that very day. That was normal practice. You don't go to jail for 5, 6, 10 years. You would actually be executed at sunset after you had time to say your final prayers and say goodbye to your family and all of that. So he's just been found guilty, and he's going to be executed. So is he afraid? He actually says, no, I'm not. And this is because the fear of death is the pretense of wisdom. It's not real wisdom. It's the appearance of knowing the unknown. No one knows whether death, which they in their fear believe to be the greatest evil, they don't know. It may turn out to be the greatest good. So think about that. Can you rationally fear the unknown? And he claims no. Well, why not? Because it's unknown. Since death does affect the body, so could you fear dying rationally? And I think the answer is yes. We have enough evidence to show that as the body shuts down and disintegrates, it's very uncomfortable, and we should be afraid of that. Okay, so that's not an irrational fear. The fear of dying does make sense. But the fear of death upon consciousness, the effect of death upon consciousness, that's yet to be determined. If we have a soul, or if consciousness exists as a kind of energy, how do we know that it doesn't survive the disintegration of the body? We don't know that now. Thousands of years later, we don't know that. And we also didn't know it then. So how can we say that death is a bad thing when we do not even know what death is? Now, he offers another argument to this. He says death is one of two things. Now, I don't know what it is, but I know it's one of two things. It's an either or. Either there's something or there's nothing. Okay, well, I guess he's right. There's something or there's nothing. He then says, in either scenario, I'm okay with it. Because if it's a nothingness, it's like going to sleep. And I'm not afraid of that at this point. And if it's a something, or a migration of the soul from one world to the other, then why should we fear that? Because if we've lived a life of virtue, doing good work, then we can continue on in that next life in a happy way. So that's interesting. What does he say he will do in that next life? Interestingly, he says he will seek out famous people who died from the past, specifically the heroes of the Iliad and Odyssey, and he will continue to question and examine them on what they were famous for. So like Ajax and his strength, or Achilles and his agility. It's sort of like me saying, when I die, I'm going to go, if there's an afterlife, I'm going to seek out Abraham Lincoln and ask him about honesty. And this is a kind of fun aspect of Socrates' personality, that he intends to go on acting as the gadfly of the afterlife, just as he did of his actual life. So these are his famous last words. The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways. I go off to die. You go off to live. Which is better, God only knows. Okay. So then he's marched out of the courtroom, and he believes he's going to be executed at the end of that day. All right, so this was Plato's Apology of Socrates. It serves as a great introduction to his personality, the benefit he thought philosophy had for himself, as well as the benefit for what philosophy could do for others. I think it's understandable why not everyone approved of him and embraced him. And if you've ever been refuted and shown that you were not an expert in something you had claimed expertise in, you understand how painful wounded pride can be. So I get it. I get why they sentenced him to death. But at the same time, I respect Socrates for his humility. It's not easy to admit you don't know something, to admit that we're ignorant. But it's interestingly, that's the first step towards wisdom, is the recognition that we are not wise. And once we really accept that, our minds open to new horizons and new roads appear down which we can travel in order to answer all of the questions that life has before us. Okay, so there is a plot twist. He thought he was about to die, but it turns out he doesn't actually die this day. We are going to read his death scene, which takes place in a story called the Phaedo, a little bit later on in the course. Up next is Plato's Republic, and we actually go back in time 30 years, and we get to see Socrates have some of these complex and challenging conversations with people. The very kinds of conversations that resulted in the Athenian people forming a kind of negative bias towards him. Once we finish the Republic, which contains Plato's main philosophy, we will then read the Phaedo and see Socrates die.